Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video focusing on development theories, looking at modernisation theory. Development theories look to explain how the process of development takes place, and one of the most influential theories in the post-World War II era was modernisation theory. But what is modernisation theory? Modernisation theory was suggested by Walt Rostow in the early 1960s whilst he was working for the US State Department. Rostow looked to explain how nations develop, drawing on the ideas of functionalists such as Durkheim and Ferdinand Tönnies. He argued that nations develop through distinct stages, and cited the growth of European nations during the Industrial Revolution as an example. Rostow argued that nations have to fulfill certain criteria before they can evolve to the next phase. Key to the transition through the different stages was the promotion of Western values, such as scientific and rational thinking, individualism, and an entrepreneurial spirit. These values help nations to modernise as they progress from traditional societies to developed consumerist societies. Rostow identified 5 different stages that nations progress through in their journey towards modernisation. Starting from traditional societies based upon collectivism, subsistence agriculture, and a population distributed largely in rural areas, through to an age of mass consumption that is typical of Western societies. Rostow argued this transition does not happen overnight, and that the right conditions need to be in place to meet the next stage, the preconditions for takeoff. Once these have been established, then nations can emerge through increasing trade and developing their infrastructure. Eventually, they will progress to being a developed nation, one based on mass consumption of goods and being a largely service sector economy. Let's look at the different conditions within each stage more closely. Rostow argued in the period following World War II, many nations, at this time deemed to be Third World nations, were traditional societies, similar to pre-industrial Europe. Their economies were based largely on subsistence agriculture. These societies had a lack of technology, and most work was done by hand, which resulted in low profits and inability to trade the surplus goods they produced. Largely rural populations also hindered trade, as poor transport and communication links meant that people would often only produce enough for their extended kinship network or the local villages. In order to develop, Rostow argued the need for investment in technology and education into Western values. The second stage, preconditions for takeoff, found that once a surplus can be generated, it can be invested into machinery and transport links which help nations to develop a trade infrastructure and set up the preconditions for takeoff. As developing nations start to reap the rewards of using machinery in agriculture, it also allows them to create surplus of primary goods for export to other nations. For Rostow, at this point, it's important to educate those at the top of the social hierarchy, the elites, in Western values first, so that their expertise and knowledge gained can be trickled down to the rest of society. Starting with those in power enables Western values to be introduced in a top-down fashion, dictating a change in the values of a nation and preparing them for the next stage, the takeoff. At this stage, nations have the ability to trade larger surpluses with other nations and reinvest profits into developing the infrastructure further, maybe even diversifying from primary goods like cash crops such as coffee, wheat and grain, to secondary goods, textiles and light manufacturing. At this stage there is an emergence of a social hierarchy, as individuals become socially mobile and those with the right skills and attributes gain higher status as meritocracy and individualism take hold. The increased investment in business, in part through attracting overseas investment, will have a trickle-down effect, and formal employment, usually through TNCs, will replace informal employment and subsistence farming, helping the economy to grow, according to Rostow. This leads to the fourth stage, the drive to maturity, whereby investment spreads to the social infrastructure, developing hospitals and education systems, as well as further investment in the economic infrastructure to improve communications and transport links, which will fuel further growth. The development of international airports, ports and rail links aids the distribution of goods and promotes further overseas investment, all of which boost the capacity to produce and distribute products. The growth of media also helps to reinforce the newly acquired Western values. Mass urbanization and the growth of formal employment will start to generate consumption of goods on a mass scale, moving nations onto the fifth and final stage. In the age of mass consumption, nations will be similar in their structure to Western developed nations. Individuals will become consumers of goods rather than producers, and the economy will shift from manufacturing and agriculture to service sector economies. The wealth generated from formal employment and movement up the class system will also promote higher standards of living, and this allows consumers to purchase the goods that they make. This is the end game for modernization theorists, to develop nations to be like Western nations, which other theorists suggest promotes the needs of capitalism, generating new markets for transnational corporations and cheaper sources of labour. It's important to assess the impact of modernisation theory on development policy, particularly given the importance it had in the 1960s and 1970s. As a system of spreading capitalism during a period of ideological warfare between industrial capitalist nations and communist ones, that is, the Cold War, Rostow's theory was applied to many developing nations, promoting ideas of entrepreneurship, high consumption and individual gain. Whilst its effectiveness has been questioned, particularly by dependency and post-development theories, it heavily influenced neoliberal development policies, particularly the trickle-down effect and the reliance upon trade over aid. However, it has been heavily criticised. It was based upon Western models of industrialisation, which cannot always be applied to other nations. The Industrial Revolution in Western Europe was largely the result of colonialism and conflict, and yet modernisation theory offers an alternative based upon internal motivations to succeed. It's an ethnocentric model that fails to take into account cultural and regional differences, and the use of social engineering of societies, through the use of the media, education and employment, has been criticised as being a form of cultural imperialism. Finally, while much aid was given to developing nations, they struggled to repay their debts. Aid repayments account for much of the surplus that is generated by these nations as they develop, and trade relationships are often weighted in favour of the West, something which creates a dependency on aid, according to Marxist theories of development. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on theories of development, focusing on modernisation theory. Thanks for watching.